Anchorage, Alaska, October 2022. The air, already sharp with the promise of winter, carried the scent of wood smoke and curing hides. From the gravel road that serviced the handful of properties in this off-grid valley, Isaiah's cabin looked like a wounded beast. A conventional, sturdy log home was being methodically encased in a grotesque second skin of timber, moss, and enormous overlapping patches of dark brown moose hide. It was a structure born of desperation and deep, unconventional knowledge. And to his family, it was a profound embarrassment. His brother-in-law's truck, a gleaming silver F250 that never saw a speck of mud, crunched to a halt. Rick stepped out, his pristine Carhartt jacket a fashion statement, not a tool. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief and disgust. Beside him, Isaiah's wife, Marlene, wouldn't even look at the house. She stared at her feet, her cheeks burning with a shame that felt hotter than the autumn sun. "For God's sake, Isaiah," Rick said, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. He gestured with a dismissive sweep of his hand at the half-finished hide wall. "What is this? Are you mad? People will think we have squatters living out here. You built a cave, not a home." Marlene finally looked up, her eyes pleading. "He's right, Isaiah. It's awful. My family is coming for Thanksgiving. What am I supposed to tell them? That we live in an animal den?" Isaiah paused his work. He was stitching two massive sections of hide together with sinew, his hands steady and precise. He looked from his wife's humiliated face to Rick's smug condescension. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply stated a fact. "It will be warm," he said, and turned back to his work, pulling the stitch tight. The finality in his tone ended the conversation. The mockery, however, had just begun. Rick shook his head, muttered "crazy fool" under his breath, and guided his sister back to the truck as if rescuing her from a madman. What did this quiet wildlife ranger, a man who studied animal dens for a living, understand about thermal dynamics and survival architecture that his well-off, suburban-dwelling family had so tragically missed? This story is about more than just an unusual house. It's about two conflicting ideas of what a home is meant to be: a symbol of status or a tool for survival. It's a story about betrayal, resilience, and the silent, undeniable authority of a thermometer at 40 below. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand the profound difference between a house that looks warm and a house that is warm. So stick around. If you've ever wondered what ancient wisdom we've lost in our pursuit of modern comfort, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Isaiah was not a carpenter. He was not an architect or an engineer. He was a student of the wild. For 15 years, his job as a wildlife ranger had been to understand the creatures of the Alaskan wilderness on their own terms. He didn't just track their movements. He studied their lives. He had spent weeks observing how a grizzly bear prepares its winter den, digging into a hillside below the frost line, using the Earth's own thermal mass to stabilize the temperature. He'd crawled into abandoned wolf dens and felt the lingering warmth, marveling at their genius for ventilation, a low entrance to trap heat, a small, high exit for stale air. He knew the insulating properties of snow, the wind-breaking power of a spruce stand, the solar absorption of dark fir. The objects of his trade were not nail guns and levels. They were game cameras, telemetry receivers, soil thermometers, and the silent, patient art of observation. He had married Marlene 7 years ago, drawn to her energy and laughter, a bright spark from the city. She was from a family that had done well in Anchorage construction. Not the hands-on work, but the lucrative business of developing comfortable, modern subdivisions. To them, a home was a product, an assembly of 2x6s, fiberglass insulation, and triple-pane windows, all culminating in a high resale value package. Marlene loved the idea of the wilderness, the romance of the log cabin Isaiah had built with his own hands on a plot of land he'd acquired through a state land lottery years before. The romance, however, quickly wore thin. Their son, Elias, was born, and the realities of off-grid life began to chafe. The constant work of chopping wood, the temperamental generator, the long, dark winters that felt isolating so far from her family's warm, brightly lit lodge in a subdivision on the Anchorage hillside. She saw Isaiah's quiet competence not as strength, but as a stubborn refusal to modernize. His preference for simple, durable solutions struck her as cheap. She wanted granite countertops and a reliable furnace, not a wood stove and a composting toilet. The tension had been building for years, a low-grade hum of resentment beneath the surface of their marriage. The hide house was not the cause of the fracture, but the earthquake that split it wide open. For Isaiah, it was the logical application of everything he knew. The previous winter had been hard. They had burned through 7 cords of birch, and still on the coldest nights, a layer of ice would form on the inside of the north-facing wall. Elias had a persistent cough all winter. Isaiah had spent the summer planning his solution, not with blueprints from a magazine, but with principles he'd learned from a hibernating bear. For Marlene, it was the final, public humiliation. Her brother, Rick, had been relentless in his criticism of Isaiah's lifestyle. Rick's own home was a monument to modern Alaskan construction, a 4,000-square-foot lodge with vaulted ceilings, a 2-story wall of windows facing the Chugach Mountains, and a radiant floor heating system powered by a massive propane boiler. It was beautiful, expensive, and, in Rick's view, the only civilized way to live in the North. He saw Isaiah as a primitive throwback, a man deliberately choosing hardship, and he frequently told Marlene she and Elias deserved better. Unbeknownst to Isaiah, Marlene had begun to agree. A few weeks before he started construction on the hide wall, she had driven into Anchorage to meet Rick for lunch. He'd slid a stack of documents across the table. It was a quitclaim deed. He had explained it was for her protection. Isaiah's living in a fantasy world, he'd said. If something happens, this land, this house, it's all tied up in his name. You and Elias could be left with nothing. He told her that with her signature, using the power of attorney Isaiah had given her years ago for emergencies, she could transfer the property title into Rick's name. He would hold it for safekeeping, ensuring she and the boy always had a real home to fall back on. His home. It was a simple legal maneuver, he assured her, a safety net. Fueled by years of frustration and Rick's persuasive confidence, Marlene had signed. She told herself it was for Elias. She told herself it was just a piece of paper. But as she watched Isaiah stretch that first foul-smelling hide over the frame, she knew she had made a choice. She had chosen Rick's world over her husband's. The conventional failure was happening in plain sight, celebrated as a triumph of design. Rick's lodge was a perfect case study in how to build a thermally inefficient structure. Its primary flaw was its complete disregard for the physics of a cold climate. The 2-story wall of windows, his pride and joy, was a catastrophic energy liability. Even with expensive triple-pane glass, a window has an R value of around 3 or 4. A standard insulated wall is R21. That glass wall was, in thermal terms, a gaping hole. In the dead of winter, it would bleed thousands of BTUs of heat per hour. The heat, generated by his monstrously large propane boiler, would rise into the 25-foot vaulted ceilings, leaving the ground floor perpetually cool and drafty, while the furnace worked constantly to compensate. The architectural style, all sharp angles and dramatic cantilevers, was riddled with thermal bridges, places where insulation was discontinuous, allowing heat to conduct directly through the structure to the outside. Every exposed beam, every corner where walls met, was a miniature highway for heat to escape. The house was designed for visual appeal, not thermal performance. It was built to impress guests, not to withstand a polar vortex. Its greatest vulnerability was its complexity and dependence on external systems. The radiant floor heating, the forced air furnace, the electric pumps, all of it relied on a constant, uninterrupted supply of propane and electricity. The 500-gallon propane tank, which seemed enormous, was barely enough to last 6 weeks in the coldest part of winter. The lodge wasn't a shelter, it was a life support system, and its umbilical cords to the grid and the fuel truck were fragile. To Isaiah, Rick's house was the opposite of resilient. It was a beautiful, fragile egg, completely unaware of the coming hammer. Isaiah's innovation began not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, methodical work of setting posts. He dug holes 3 feet out from the foundation of his log cabin, sinking treated posts every 4 feet. Between these, he built a secondary exterior wall frame, creating an 18-inch cavity between the new frame and the existing log walls. This was the core of his design. The community of off-gridders in the valley watched with bemused curiosity. Jedediah, his nearest neighbor, a retired fisherman who'd seen it all, leaned on his fence one afternoon. "Gonna build a whole second house around the first one, Isaiah?" he asked, a grin crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Just a thick coat," Isaiah replied, without looking up from his work. The mockery began in earnest when the insulation started going in. Isaiah didn't buy pink fiberglass bats or spray foam. He spent weeks harvesting materials from his own land, a right granted by his permit. He gathered bag after bag of sphagnum moss from a boggy area, laying it out on tarps to dry in the sun. He scythed tall grasses from the meadow, letting them cure until they were brittle and light. He mixed this with shredded birch bark and wood shavings from his woodpile. Into the 18-inch cavity between the 2 walls, he packed this blend of natural insulation, tamping it down until it was dense and firm. Rick and Marlene drove out one weekend during this phase. Rick kicked at a pile of dried moss. "You're packing your walls with fire starter and mouse nests," he declared. "This is insane. The whole thing will be a rotten, mold-infested mess by spring. There's a reason people use vapor barriers and fiberglass, you know. It's called building science." "Animals have been using this science for 1,000,000 years, Isaiah said calmly, stuffing a fresh armload of grass into the wall cavity. The final step was the most visually shocking: the hide. Isaiah was a licensed hunter, and for years he had saved the largest, best quality hides from moose and caribou he had taken for meat. He had tanned them himself using traditional methods, a long, laborious process that resulted in thick, pliable, waterproof leather. Now he began stretching these massive hides over the outer frame, overlapping them like giant shingles and stitching them together with heavy-gauge artificial sinew. The dark, textured surface absorbed the weak autumn sunlight, and even from a distance you could feel a faint warmth radiating from it. He sealed the seams with a mixture of rendered bear fat and pine pitch, a sticky, aromatic waterproofing compound that was ugly but effective. Marlene was mortified. "It smells, Isaiah," she pleaded. "It looks pagan." "The smell will fade," he said. "What's left will be warmth." He was creating a multi-layered system that mimicked the natural world. The log cabin was the inner sanctum. The 18-inch cavity packed with moss and grass was the thick layer of fat and fur. The outer hide was the tough, waterproof, windproof skin. He wasn't building a cave. He was building an ark designed to float on a sea of cold. The physics behind Isaiah's creation were both simple and profound. He had intuitively grasped 4 key principles of thermodynamics that Rick's expensive, professionally built lodge ignored. The first was the sheer power of bulk insulation. The R value of loose-fill dried grass and moss is low, perhaps R 2.5 per inch. Modern fiberglass is R 3.7. Rick would have scoffed at that number, but Isaiah wasn't using 3.5 inches of insulation like in a standard wall. He was using 18 inches. The total R value of his wall system wasn't R21. It was closer to R45, more than double a conventional home, and he'd achieved it for the cost of his own labor. This massive thermal break simply slowed the transfer of heat by conduction to a crawl. The heat from his small wood stove would stay inside for hours, even days, before it could leak through that much material. The second principle was eliminating wind convection. Wind is a heat thief. It strips warmth from a building's surface through convection. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit has the same cooling effect as minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit still air. Rick's lodge, with its conventional siding, had thousands of tiny cracks and seams that allowed wind to penetrate, creating drafts and chilling the structure. Isaiah's hide wall was, for all practical purposes, a single, monolithic surface. The overlapping pitched sealed hides were virtually impervious to wind. The brutal Alaskan gales would hit the hide and flow over it, unable to rob the building of its precious warmth. He had created a dead air space, the holy grail of insulation. Third was thermal mass. The original log walls of his cabin, now protected deep inside the new envelope, acted as a heat sink. They would absorb the warmth from the wood stove all day long. When the fire died down at night, the logs would slowly radiate that stored heat back into the living space, stabilizing the indoor temperature. Rick's house, with its drywall and empty air-filled spaces, had very little thermal mass. When his furnace shut off, the temperature inside would plummet within minutes. Finally, there was the principle of the thermal envelope. Isaiah had wrapped his entire living space in an unbroken blanket of insulation. There were no thermal bridges. The windows and door of the original log cabin were now deeply recessed within the new wall, protected from the wind, their heat loss dramatically reduced. He had created a structure that was fundamentally in harmony with its environment, not at war with it. It didn't fight the cold with brute force and massive energy consumption. It placidly shrugged it off. It was a fortress of warmth, and its testing time was coming. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as an invading army. In late November, a Siberian weather system, a true polar vortex, descended upon Alaska. Temperatures plummeted to levels not seen in a decade. It started at 10 below, then 20, then 30. The wind howled out of the north, a steady, relentless 30-mile-per-hour gale that drove the wind chill to a life-threatening minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The power grid, strained by the colossal demand, began to fail. Substations blew, power lines, heavy with ice and lashed by the wind, snapped. Anchorage and the surrounding valleys were plunged into rolling blackouts, then a sustained, indefinite outage. For Rick, it was the beginning of a nightmare. His lodge's furnace went silent. The backup generator kicked on, a roaring beast in the garage, but he knew it was devouring propane at a terrifying rate, a gallon an hour. The house, which had felt so grand and spacious, now felt like a giant refrigerated barn. The great wall of windows was no longer a beautiful view. It was a terrifying wall of cold. A thick, feathery layer of ice grew on the inside of the glass. The radiant floor went cold. The family huddled in the living room, wearing their ski gear indoors, feeding the decorative fireplace with anything that would burn. Magazines, then chairs, then the cherry wood from his prized bar. The temperature in the house dropped to 45, then 40. Pipes in the north-facing walls began to freeze with audible groans and pops. At Isaiah's cabin, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. The wood stove, a small, efficient Danish model, glowed with a steady warmth. It needed to be fed only every 8 hours. Outside, the wind shrieked, but inside, there was only a profound, insulated silence. The temperature held at a steady 68 degrees. There were no drafts. There was no ice on the windows. Marlene cooked a stew on the stovetop, the air filling with the scent of beef and vegetables, a domestic aroma that was an act of defiance against the Arctic siege outside. Elias, oblivious to the crisis gripping the region, played on the floor with his toy trucks, wearing only a long-sleeved shirt. One evening, as Isaiah sat reading by the light of an oil lamp, Elias looked up from his toys and asked the question that would shatter Marlene's defenses. "Dad," he said, his voice clear in the quiet room, "why does our house stay warm and Uncle Rick's is so cold? He has a bigger fire." Isaiah looked at Marlene. Her face was pale. The simple, honest question from her son had stripped away all her justifications, all her embarrassment. It laid bare the essential truth. In this place, at this time, all that mattered was the simple fact of warmth. Her brother's grand vision of success was freezing, while her husband's primitive shelter was a sanctuary of life. The thermometer on the wall was the only judge that mattered, and its verdict was absolute. The call came on the third day of the outage. It was Rick, his voice strained and thin over a crackling cell connection. "The generator's out of fuel," he said without any preamble. "It's 34 degrees in here. The pipes are bursting. We're in trouble, Isaiah." There was a pause. Can you take Marlene and Elias? Just until they get the power back." It wasn't a request. It was a plea for rescue. "I'm on my way," Isaiah said. The drive was treacherous. The world outside was a maelstrom of white. When he arrived, the lodge looked like a ghost ship, dark and frozen. Marlene and Elias were huddled under a pile of blankets, their breath misting in the air. Rick's face was gray with exhaustion and defeat. There were no more taunts, no more condescension. He just helped Isaiah get his sister and nephew into the truck, his movements stiff with cold. "Thank you," he whispered, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. Back at the cabin, the transition was jarring. From the frozen, silent misery of the lodge to the enveloping, quiet warmth of the hide house. Marlene began to weep, deep, shuddering sobs of relief, shame, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of the mistake she had made. She had bet on the wrong man, the wrong philosophy, the wrong definition of home. A week later, the storm broke, and the power was restored. The extent of the damage across the region was immense. Hundreds of homes had suffered frozen pipes, costing millions in repairs. Rick's lodge was a disaster zone. But as life began to return to a fragile normalcy, his arrogance returned with it. He drove out to the cabin, his tone no longer desperate, but authoritative. "All right, this foolishness is over," he announced to Isaiah. "The emergency's passed. I want that disgusting hide off my property. You can start tearing it down this weekend." Isaiah looked at him, then at Marlene, who stood silently by the door. "Your property?" he asked quietly. "Yes, my property," Rick snapped, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "Marlene signed it over. It's all legal. I own this land. And I'm not having a hobo shack sitting on it." Isaiah nodded slowly. He went to a small wooden chest where he kept his important papers and retrieved a file. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply laid out his own documents on the kitchen table. The first was a copy of the quitclaim deed Rick was brandishing. The second was a printout from the municipal website declaring a state of emergency for their district during the polar vortex. The third was a copy of his credentials as a licensed and certified wilderness survival instructor and guide. The last was a single sheet of paper with a highlighted section of the Alaska Municipal Code. "This is Alaska Statute 29.35.190, Isaiah said, his voice level. Emergency shelter provisions. It states that during a declared state of emergency, any private structure deemed a viable shelter by a certified guide and used as such supersedes any and all non-primary resident ownership claims for the duration of the emergency and for 90 days following. Your signature, he said, looking at Marlene. His eyes filled not with anger but with a deep, weary sadness, is on this deed. But your physical presence here, seeking refuge under the Emergency Act, legally voids your claim of transfer under duress. This house, by law, functioned as an emergency shelter, and I was its certified operator. He tapped the paper. You don't own this land, Rick. Your attempt to take it failed. You have 30 days to file a legal challenge, which you will lose, or you can leave now. Rick stared at the papers, his face draining of color. He looked at Marlene, expecting her to protest, to defend him. But she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She had been played for a fool by her brother, and saved by the husband she had betrayed. Rick, speechless for the first time in his life, turned and walked out. The door closed, leaving behind a profound silence. It was in that silence that Isaiah looked at the home he had built, a structure born of mockery and necessity. The narrator's voice could have crystallized the moment. You didn't build a cave, he might have said. You built a lifeboat. The story of the Hyde House spread through the valley like wildfire. In the aftermath of the Great Freeze, people started looking at their own homes differently. They had seen how quickly their modern comforts could fail them. They had heard about Isaiah's cabin, the place that stayed warm when the whole world went cold. Jedediah was the first to come by, hat in hand. Isaiah, he said, I laughed at what you were building. I was wrong. Can you show me how you did it? Soon, others followed. Families from down the road, people from other valleys, even a few chastened homeowners from the Anchorage suburbs who had faced catastrophic repair bills. They came not to mock, but to learn. Isaiah, a man of few words, taught them with his hands. He didn't lecture, he demonstrated. He showed them how to build the secondary frame, how to harvest and dry the moss, how to stitch the hides. He explained the principles of the thermal envelope, of wind breaking, of mass. He gave his knowledge away freely, just as the wilderness had given it to him. By the following autumn, variations of his design began to appear all over the region. Some used milled lumber and commercial tarps instead of hides. Others used reclaimed foam insulation in the wall cavity. But the principle was the same. A super-insulated, airtight outer shell that protected the inner home. They were dubbed Isaiah houses by the locals. His quiet, ridiculed project had become a regional architectural movement, a grassroots response to a shared vulnerability. Marlene stayed. The betrayal had carved a deep wound in their marriage, one that would take years to heal. But in the ruins of her old beliefs, something new began to grow, a profound respect for the quiet, deep wisdom of her husband. She saw him not as a stubborn primitive, but as a man whose connection to the real world ran deeper than anyone she knew. Elias, now 8 years old, became his father's shadow. He helped mix the pine pitch and carry the dried moss. He learned the names of the trees, the habits of the animals, and the deep, satisfying logic of building something with your own hands that truly worked. He was learning a language older than words, a grammar of survival written in wood and hide and stone. The technique Isaiah deployed was not new. It was ancient. But he had rediscovered it and applied it in a modern context, anticipating by decades the principles of the passive house movement, a modern building standard that emphasizes super insulation and air tightness to radically reduce energy consumption. His hide-in-cavity wall was a low-tech, bioregional version of a double-stud wall with dense-packed cellulose insulation, one of the cornerstones of high-performance building today. He proved that resilience doesn't always come from more complex technology, but often from a deeper understanding of fundamental principles. He had built a 21st century survival shelter using Ice Age wisdom. In the end, this story is about the collision of two different kinds of wealth. There is the wealth of the modern world, money, status, and possessions, symbolized by Rick's beautiful, fragile lodge. It is a wealth that is loud, impressive, and utterly dependent on the systems that support it. Then there is an older, quieter wealth, the wealth of knowledge, of competence, of resilience. It is the ability to provide for oneself and one's family when the systems fail. It doesn't reside in a bank account, but in the hands and the mind. Isaiah's story is a powerful reminder that in the harshest environments, the ultimate luxury is not comfort, it is survival. The laws of physics are unforgiving, and they do not care about aesthetics. They reward what works. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this exploration of resilience and ingenuity valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think our modern homes have made us more or less secure? Until next time, stay curious. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical and modern survival practices. Any application of these building techniques should be undertaken in compliance with current local building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.